The mug was already halfway to my lips when something inside me froze. The kitchen was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, and the steam from the tea curled up into my face with a bitter edge that didn't belong there. Sunlight cut across the counter, catching dust in the air, and my heart started pounding for no clear reason, as if my body had recognized a threat before my mind could. If you've ever trusted the wrong person or felt danger without knowing why, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen closer to home than we like to admit. My hand trembled, my thoughts slowed, and from the corner of the room I felt small eyes watching me, silent and alert. In that suspended second, I understood something was terribly wrong, even if I couldn't explain it yet. That was the moment everything started to unravel. The kettle clicked off, and the sound felt too loud in the quiet of my kitchen. Late morning light rested on the counter, soft and ordinary, the kind of moment I had lived through 1,000 times without thinking. I remember wrapping my fingers around the mug, breathing in steam, feeling steady enough to trust the routine. That was when something shifted inside me, a faint unease I couldn't name yet, like my body noticed danger before my mind could. The tea looked darker than usual. The smell felt wrong, heavier, almost sharp. My hand hesitated in the air, caught between habit and instinct. I told myself not to be dramatic, not to imagine things. I had always been told I was getting forgetful, that I worried too much. Still, my heart started to pound, slow and heavy, as if it already knew what I didn't want to admit. From the corner of the room, I felt the presence of my grandson. He was standing there, silent like always, watching me in a way that made the air feel thick. His eyes didn't wander. They stayed on the cup. In that suspended moment, I realized something terrifying. If I lifted that mug and drank what was waiting for me, this ordinary morning could have been the last proof I ever existed as myself, and that single hesitation forced me to wonder who I really was and who everyone else had already decided I was becoming. For most of my life, I knew exactly who I was. I had built a quiet, steady independence that didn't need applause to feel real. I lived alone by choice, not because I had no one, but because I valued my space and my routines. I paid my own bills, kept my own schedule, remembered birthdays, appointments, small promises. I trusted my mind. I trusted myself. I took pride in the ordinary things. Mornings that began the same way. Evenings that ended with a book or the television humming softly in the background. I wasn't chasing anything new. I was simply living the life I had earned. And for a long time, that felt like enough. Somewhere along the way, though, the way people looked at me began to change. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Gentle reminders that felt unnecessary, questions asked twice, then a third time, just to be sure. Concern dressed up as kindness. I told myself it was love, that it was normal, that I was imagining the tension beneath it. Then came the comments that lingered longer than they should have, little suggestions that maybe I was more tired lately, that maybe I seemed distracted, that maybe I had already told that story before. None of it was cruel. That was what made it dangerous. It slipped inside me quietly. I started second-guessing myself, standing in a room and wondering why I had walked in there, checking the calendar more often, apologizing for things I wasn't sure I'd done wrong. I didn't feel broken, but I began to feel unsure, as if my reflection no longer matched the version of me others were slowly describing. And somewhere in that gap, between who I believed I was and who I was being treated as, something fragile began to crack. That was when I started paying closer attention to the people closest to me, especially my son and the woman he trusted most. My son had always been a good man, not loud or demanding, not the kind who needed to be right all the time. He was gentle by nature, the type who avoided conflict even when it cost him something. As a child, he was thoughtful. As an adult, he became careful. I loved that about him, even when I worried it made life harder than it needed to be. When he married his wife, I told myself he had found balance. She was confident where he was cautious, decisive where he hesitated. She carried herself with a polish that made people listen. I admired her drive at first. She seemed capable, organized, always thinking ahead. I trusted that she would take care of him in ways I no longer needed to. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They never do. It started with small things that felt almost reasonable. Decisions being made without asking me, conversations that seemed to end just before I entered the room, suggestions about what was best for me offered gently enough that I felt ungrateful questioning them. Over time, her presence began to fill the space around me. She decided schedules, routines, even small preferences I hadn't realized were being watched. My son stood nearby, quiet, often looking relieved that someone else was taking charge. When I felt uneasy, I blamed myself for being sensitive. I told myself families change, that roles shift, that I needed to adjust. I ignored the moments that should have made me pause, the way she spoke for him, the way he deferred without noticing, the way my own opinions seemed to carry less weight each time. None of it felt dangerous on its own. That's why I let it continue. Looking back, I see how easily trust and love can blur into something else when no one stops to question the direction it's taking. And while I was focused on the adults in the room, there was someone else watching quietly, absorbing everything, someone I never imagined would become the key to understanding what was really happening. My grandson was always quiet, the kind of quiet adults rush to explain away. People used words like delayed or distant, as if silence automatically meant absence. They spoke about him in careful tones, lowering their voices even when he was in the room, assuming he wasn't really listening. I never believed that. From the first time I watched him sit on the floor with his toys, lining them up just so, I sensed something deeper, working behind his eyes. When I spent time with him, I noticed how closely he observed everything. He tracked movements, moods, changes in the room. He noticed when tension crept into conversations, when voices tightened, when someone entered a space carrying impatience or control. He didn't fidget much. He watched. And when our eyes met, there was a steadiness there that didn't fit the story others told about him. I felt a bond grow between us without words. I would sit nearby, reading or folding laundry, and he would drift closer, always within reach. There was comfort in that closeness, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be explained. I trusted him instinctively, even when I couldn't have said why. It felt protective, almost maternal in a way that surprised me. What troubled me was how carefully his world was managed. Every choice around him seemed controlled: his schedule, his food, his access to people. Even small moments alone felt monitored. I told myself it was concern, that caring for a child like him required structure. Still, something about it made my chest tighten. Looking back, I see what I missed then. While the adults debated and decided, he was absorbing everything. Every look, every shift in tone, every truth that slipped out when people thought he wasn't paying attention. He was always watching. And soon, circumstances would leave just the two of us together, alone in that quiet house, with no one else to interpret his silence for him. When they left, the house didn't feel empty right away. It felt paused. My son hugged me longer than usual, his wife reminding me of routines I already knew by heart. Then the door closed, and the quiet settled in, heavier than I expected. It was just me and my grandson, the hum of the refrigerator, and the soft rhythm of days stretching ahead of us. I slipped into care mode without thinking. Meals, baths, tidying up toys, reading in the evenings. I made tea every morning, the same way I always had, letting the kettle click off and pouring slowly, grateful for the warmth. The repetition was comforting at first, familiar, reliable. It gave the days a shape. By the third morning, I noticed a haze that didn't lift. My thoughts felt slow, like they were moving through water. I blamed poor sleep. Caring for a child, even a quiet one, takes more out of you than you realize. I kept drinking the tea, telling myself it helped me focus, helped me stay steady. The house grew quieter as the days passed, too quiet. My grandson followed me from room to room, calm, observant, his presence grounding me even as my body felt less certain. Sometimes I would forget what I had just done. I would stand at the counter, unsure if I had already eaten, already cleaned, already locked the door. It frightened me, but only in flashes. The fear never stayed long enough to fully form. The air itself felt thick, like it pressed in on my chest. I stopped calling friends, telling myself I didn't want to be a bother. I stopped questioning the fog, convincing myself it was temporary, that rest would fix it. Looking back now, that week feels unreal, like a loop I couldn't step out of. At the time, I only knew that something was wrong, hovering just beyond my ability to name it. And then, without warning, the silence that had wrapped itself around us was about to break. The kitchen was still wrapped in that familiar haze I had grown used to. I stood at the counter with the mug in my hands, watching the surface of the tea ripple as I moved. My thoughts felt slow, distant, as if the moment were happening a few seconds behind me. I remember feeling oddly calm, suspended in routine, just before everything split open. I lifted the cup, the steam warming my face, and that was when it happened. A sudden presence behind me, small hands gripping my arm with a strength I didn't expect. The shock traveled through my body before my mind could catch up. My heart lurched, my grip faltered, and the mug tipped just enough for liquid to spill across the counter instead of into me. I turned, breath caught in my throat, and saw my grandson's face up close. His eyes were wide, urgent, locked onto mine with a clarity that stole the air from my lungs. In that instant, the fog cracked. My body reacted first, stepping back, pulse racing, skin buzzing with awareness I hadn't felt all week. The realization hit harder than the fear. This child, the one everyone had spoken around and over, had understood exactly what was happening. His silence hadn't been emptiness. It had been restraint, awareness, protection. The room felt smaller as the truth pressed in on me from every side. I stood there shaking, staring at the tea soaking into a dish towel, knowing that something irreversible had just occurred. Whatever I thought I understood about my life, my family, and this quiet child was no longer intact. Nothing could return to the way it had been before that moment. And as I steadied myself, I sensed that he was finally ready to let me see what he had been carrying alone for far too long. Once the shock settled, what came through him wasn't confusion. It was fear that had been carefully managed for far too long. I could feel it in the way his body stayed tense even after the danger passed, in how his eyes kept checking the doorway as if someone might return at any moment. This wasn't a child startled by one bad moment. This was a child who had been living inside a plan he never agreed to. Little by little, the weight he had been carrying became clear to me. He hadn't been silent because he couldn't speak. He had been silent because he had been warned, because he had learned that quiet kept him safer than honesty. He understood consequences in a way no child ever should, and that understanding had shaped every careful move he made. I realized he had been coached to watch, to remember, to stay still. He knew when to leave a room. He knew when to pretend not to notice things that made his stomach hurt. He had been taught that adults decide what is real, and children pay the price for challenging it. The control around him suddenly made sense, not as care, but as containment. As the truth unfolded inside me, my disbelief hardened into something sharper. I saw how routines were used to isolate him, how fear was wrapped in the language of protection. I understood that what had been happening wasn't accidental or misguided. It was deliberate, calculated, designed to keep him small and manageable. The most painful part was realizing how long this had been happening without me seeing it. How many moments I had misread. How often his silence had been mistaken for calm instead of survival. My chest burned with a protective anger I didn't try to soften or explain away. Some lines, once crossed, are unmistakable. By the time I gathered myself, one thing was painfully clear. Knowing the truth in my heart would not be enough. Whatever was happening was ongoing, and stopping it would require more than belief or instinct. I would need proof, something solid, something undeniable. I didn't go looking for answers in a dramatic way. I followed instinct, the quiet kind that settles in after denial burns itself out. While my grandson rested nearby, I moved through the house slowly, opening drawers I had never questioned before, checking spaces that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Nothing about it felt rushed. It felt necessary. The first thing I found was paper, neatly stacked, labeled, not hidden well enough to suggest panic, but not placed where curiosity would stumble on it either. I remember standing there, reading without fully understanding at first, my mind resisting the shape of what was forming. Notes about routines, adjustments, timing. Everything written with a calm, clinical precision that made my stomach tighten. As I read further, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't carelessness or confusion, it was tracking. Escalation measured over time, changes planned around my presence, my habits, my tolerance. There were reminders, schedules, observations recorded as if I were a variable instead of a person. The fog I had felt all week suddenly had a context, and that context was intentional. What struck me most was the patience behind it. Nothing hurried, nothing impulsive. Whoever created this expected time to be on their side, expected me to doubt myself longer, expected no one to intervene. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity so sharp it felt almost cold. I sat down, the papers spread out in front of me, and understood that I was no longer dealing with a misunderstanding that could be talked through. This wasn't something emotion or confrontation would stop. The planning was too deliberate, the risk too real. In that moment, something inside me steadied. Fear gave way to resolve. I knew I couldn't react. I couldn't warn. I couldn't let on that I had seen any of it. What I needed next wasn't outrage. It was strategy, proof that would stand on its own, and help from people trained to recognize exactly what this was. I sat with the evidence longer than I expected to, not because I doubted it, but because I needed to feel its full weight without letting it tip me into panic. Every instinct in me wanted to confront, to demand explanations, to force the truth into the open immediately. That impulse was loud, emotional, and dangerous. I understood then that confrontation would only serve the person who believed they were already in control. If I revealed what I knew too soon, the planning would simply change shape, the trail would disappear, and the most vulnerable person in this situation would pay the price for my need to act quickly. So I slowed myself down. I reminded myself that clarity was now my greatest protection. I reached out quietly for guidance, choosing professionals who understood patterns like this better than I ever could. I didn't tell the whole story to everyone. I told it carefully, selectively, making sure each step strengthened my position instead of exposing it. What surprised me most was how calm I became once I made that decision. Fear didn't vanish, but it stopped driving. I stopped reacting and started observing again, the way my grandson always had. I documented. I preserved. I followed advice even when it went against my emotions. That was the moment the balance shifted. I was no longer the confused, fading figure someone had written plans around. I was alert, deliberate, and patient. I knew that time could work for me too, if I used it correctly. From that point on, I chose silence with intention. I kept routines unchanged. I let appearances remain comfortable. And I allowed the person who believed their plan was unfolding to continue believing exactly that. Because sometimes the safest move is letting someone think they're winning, right up until they're not. Once I committed to waiting, I had to commit fully. There could be no cracks in the surface, no sudden strength that might raise suspicion. I leaned into the version of myself that had already been assigned to me. I forgot things on purpose. I asked unnecessary questions. I let concern sound like confusion and exhaustion look like decline. Every performance cost me something, but I paid it anyway. The hardest part was pretending not to see what I now understood clearly. When decisions were made for me, I nodded. When routines tightened, I followed them. I let my voice soften, my posture fold in on itself just enough to be believable. Inside, I was counting, watching, recording patterns the way my grandson had learned to do long before me. As the days passed, I felt the shift. Confidence crept into her movements. She corrected me less carefully. She stopped checking her tone. There was an ease in her presence that hadn't been there before, a certainty that the plan was holding, that I was exactly where she expected me to be. There were moments when waiting felt unbearable, moments when the urge to protect, to expose, to end it all immediately rose up so fast it stole my breath. I would look at my grandson and feel the weight of what could go wrong if I misstepped. That was always enough to steady me. Patience became its own kind of strength. With each passing day, she revealed more than she meant to. Habits grew sloppy. Assumptions went unguarded. The very confidence she relied on began to work against her. By the time I sensed her return approaching, I understood something crucial. She believed she had won. And in believing that, she was about to walk back into a situation she no longer controlled, unaware that every move she made next would only confirm what I already knew. I heard the car before I saw it, the low roll of tires on gravel, the familiar pause before the engine cut off. My body reacted before my thoughts did, shoulders tightening, breath slowing on purpose. I stayed where I was, hands folded, posture relaxed in all the ways that mattered to someone watching for weakness. The door opened, footsteps crossed the threshold. The house filled again, but the quiet didn't leave. It thickened. I felt it settle between us like a held breath. She moved with ease, confident, already stepping back into control. My son followed behind her, lighter somehow, uncertain in a way he didn't seem to recognize in himself. I kept my face neutral, pleasant, grateful. I played my part carefully, letting my voice stay soft, my movements unremarkable. Inside, everything was sharp. Every glance, Every shift in tone landed with meaning now. I noticed how she scanned the room, how her eyes lingered just a moment too long on certain details. I noticed how my son avoided looking at me directly, as if something unspoken sat between us. My grandson stayed close, his small body angled toward mine. I felt his awareness like a quiet signal at my side. He didn't cling. He simply stayed where he could see everything. That steadiness gave me more strength than anything else in the room. Time stretched. There were pauses where no one spoke, where the sound of breathing felt louder than it should have. I watched her confidence settle in, watched it harden into certainty. She believed the week had gone exactly as planned. That belief showed in the way she relaxed. I waited, not passively, but deliberately. Every piece was in place, every step behind me. All that remained was timing. As we gathered in the same space, the air grew heavier, charged with what could no longer stay hidden. I felt it then, the moment just before a truth breaks free. And I knew the next words spoken in that room would change everything, whether anyone was ready for them or not. The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. I could feel my pulse in my ears, steady but loud, as if my body already knew what my mind was bracing for. This was the moment everything had been circling, the moment silence could no longer protect anyone. I felt my grandson shift beside me, not nervously, not hesitantly. He straightened, small shoulders squared in a way that didn't belong to a child who was unaware or confused. My hand found his back without thinking, a quiet promise that he was not alone anymore. Whatever happened next, I would not let the truth swallow him again. What came from him wasn't sudden or chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate, shaped by years of listening instead of speaking. I watched faces change as understanding finally landed. My son froze, confusion giving way to something like horror as pieces rearranged themselves inside him, and her confidence cracked, not all at once, but in sharp fractures that spread too fast to hide. The shift in power was unmistakable. The room no longer leaned in her direction. Every attempt to redirect, to soften, to dismiss, fell flat against the weight of what could no longer be denied. The careful structure she had built collapsed under its own precision. There was no argument strong enough to carry it anymore. I felt grief rise alongside relief, grief for the time lost, for the child who had learned silence before safety, for the version of my family I thought I had. But beneath it all was clarity so clean it felt almost painful. This was right. This was necessary. And it was irreversible. My grandson stayed close, breathing steady, eyes clear. He had done the hardest thing imaginable, and in doing so, he changed everything. Not with volume, with truth. When the room finally exhaled, nothing looked the same. Relationships had shifted. Futures had cracked open. Consequences were no longer theoretical. They had shape now. As the first wave of aftermath began to roll in, I knew we were stepping into something new. It wouldn't be easy. Healing never is. But the truth had spoken out loud, and once that happens, it cannot be forced back into silence. What followed would be about protection, repair, and learning how to live honestly after everything has been laid bare. After the truth came out, everything slowed down. Adrenaline faded, and what was left was a deep, bone-level exhaustion I hadn't felt before. I slept more than I thought possible. My body needed it. My mind did too. The fog lifted gradually, not all at once, and each clear morning felt like a quiet victory I didn't announce to anyone. Recovery wasn't dramatic. It was made of appointments, Gentle monitoring, long conversations that didn't need to go anywhere in particular. I relearned how my body felt when it was safe. Hunger returned. Focus returned. I caught myself humming while making breakfast and had to stop for a moment just to let that sink in. I hadn't done that in a long time. For my grandson, healing came differently. Safety had to be proven, not promised. At first, he stayed close, always within reach, eyes still tracking every shift in a room, but slowly, that vigilance softened. He laughed more easily. He slept deeper. He began to explore without checking first. Watching that change was both beautiful and painful, because it showed how much he had been holding in before. There were losses we couldn't ignore, relationships that would never be what I once believed they were, trust that had to be rebuilt carefully, if at all. I allowed myself to grieve that without rushing to forgive or explain it away. Some things need to be named honestly before they can be laid down. The victories were small but steady. A calm afternoon. A meal eaten without anxiety. A moment where my grandson reached for my hand without fear behind it. Those moments mattered more than any grand resolution ever could. Over time, a sense of normalcy returned, not the old version, but a new one shaped by truth instead of illusion. I felt myself coming back into my own skin, grounded and alert, no longer shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. Life didn't reset. It moved forward. And as it did, I began to understand that what we had survived wasn't just a story about harm. It was also a lesson about listening, believing, and the quiet strength it takes to protect what matters most. Looking back now, after the noise has settled and the healing has had time to take root, what stays with me most is how easily silence can be mistaken for safety. I thought keeping the peace meant protecting the people I loved. I thought endurance was the same thing as strength. I was wrong. Silence has a cost, and it's usually paid by the most vulnerable person in the room. This experience didn't turn me into someone seeking revenge or justice for its own sake. It turned me into someone who understands the power of paying attention, of listening when something feels off, of believing a quiet truth even when it's inconvenient or frightening. Survival, I've learned, isn't loud. It's deliberate. It's patient. It's choosing to act before harm becomes permanent. What we went through reshaped how I see others too. I move through the world now aware that many people are carrying stories they don't yet have words for. Children, parents, grandparents, anyone can be underestimated. Anyone can be dismissed. And sometimes the bravest thing a person does is speak once, after years of being unheard. I'm grateful we survived. Grateful for the second chance to live honestly, without shrinking or pretending. Grateful for the bond that grew stronger in the quiet aftermath, built on trust instead of fear. Healing didn't erase what happened, but it gave it meaning. It taught me that being heard can change the course of a life. If this story resonated with you, thank you for staying with me through it. Truly. And if you've ever experienced something similar or carried a truth that took time to speak, I invite you to share in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment where silence nearly cost you something important? I read every message, and your voice matters here.